for Bioethics in the College of Medicine. And this panel is presented in support of the College of Public Health and the Center for Bioethics at OSU. I'm really excited to have our panelists today. We'll be speaking about the ethics of conducting research on pregnant participants, and we'll be discussing in particular the question of equitable inclusion of pregnant participants, what that should look like, what barriers there are to researching pregnant people, and how those barriers have potentially changed in light of growing political restrictions to reproductive health care across the United States. I am so excited to have these three panelists. So we first, for external panelists, we have Dr. Ann Lyerly, who is professor of social medicine at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's also a research professor in obstetrics and gynecology. Her work centers on women's health and reproductive medicine. She is founder of the Second Wave Initiative, which was an effort to ensure that the health interests of pregnant people are fairly represented in biomedical research and drug and device policies. And she's been a PI on NIH-funded and Wellcome Trust-funded projects to advance equitable inclusion of pregnant women in HIV research, research on Zika and other public health emergencies. And currently, she's the PI on an NIH-funded PREPARE project addressing the ethics of research engaging pregnant adolescents. Thank you so much for joining us today. We also have Dr. Shawnita Sealy-Jefferson, who's associate professor in epidemiology in the College of Public Health at Ohio State University. Dr. Sealy-Jefferson is a scholar activist and a social epidemiologist whose primary research seeks action to combat manifestations of structural racism that limit the human rights of Black families and communities. She's founder, director, and principal investigator of the Social Epidemiology to Eliminate Disparities, SEED Lab. And the mission of SEED Lab is to conduct high-quality epidemiological, I always get stuck on that word, I apologize, research to find solutions to the disproportionate burden of infant mortality among Black women. So welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. And then finally, we have Dr. Maged Constantine, who is professor of obstetrics and gynecology at Ohio State University. He also serves as the director of the Division of Maternal Fetal Medicine at OSU. His research focuses on the prevention of preeclampsia and other pregnancy complications in high-risk pregnant patients. And he's also published about the importance of equitable inclusion of pregnant women in clinical research. So let me just tell you what the structure of the panel is. We'll start with an introductory remarks by Dr. Drapkin Lyerly for the first 10 to 15 minutes. We will then open up the conversation to Dr. Sealy-Jefferson and Dr. Constantine to share their own experiences and perspectives related to the inclusion of pregnant participants. And then we have some questions that are preset questions that we're going to get the conversation rolling, but it's also really important to hear from you in the audience. So if you have any questions, please feel free throughout the presentation to post them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be asking those hopefully the last 20 minutes or so of the discussion. All right, so that was a lot of intro. Thank you so much for joining us. And Dr. Drapkin Lyerly, why don't you take it away? And you're muted for now.
Unmute myself. Can y'all see my screen?
We currently see you.
Oh, okay. Let me try. Share. How's that?
Much better.
Okay. So I'm delighted to be here. I wanted to thank Dr. Howard for organizing this and for inviting me. So, whoops, I don't know why I'm on that second slide. So I'll start with at the beginning. So I'll just sort of start by setting the stage. I think I'm excited for the conversation with the other panelists, but for a brief overview, we'll be talking about ethics in research with pregnant populations. So I am trained as an OBGYN, I'm trained as a bioethicist, and for the past nearly 20 years, I've been doing research on complex ethical issues in reproductive medicine, and more than half of my work has centered on the problem of the poor evidence base for therapeutics and preventives in pregnancy, which during my training in my early years was blamed on ethics. The idea was that we don't have data because, ethics precludes us from doing this complicated research, so we're just going to have to live with a poor evidence base. So having done a fellowship in bioethics, I realized that ethics wasn't just the reason you couldn't do research, but it was the reason that you needed to. So that's where the Second Wave Initiative was born. The Second Wave Initiative was an effort to sort of reframe the question of what ethics can do when it comes to research with pregnant persons, and make the case for changing the paradigm around research in pregnancy. For several years, we worked on making the case, and then I have since had a number of grants, both from the Wellcome Foundation and from NIH, that shifts not just from the question of whether you should do the research, but how. So these projects have been aimed at developing concrete guidance for inclusion of pregnant people in HIV, co-infections research, pandemic research, and most recently tackling the question of how we do research with pregnant adolescents. So, the first step in sort of making the case is sort of articulating the evidence gaps that come from not including pregnant people in biomedical research. And there's three really key gaps that kind of explain why you can't do research with non-pregnant people and then translate it to pregnant people. So the first is dosing. Clinically actionable pregnancy-specific data to guide the dosing of drugs are all but absent for pregnancy. We're starting to see a little, but it's very, very poor level of evidence there. The second is what everybody thinks of as fetal safety. So for at least 9 out of 10 drugs currently on the market, we lack adequate information about their potential to cause fetal harm. And third, although there are some excellent studies that have been done, in HIV and other contexts, there is a tendency to focus on outcomes for babies. And so we don't know the impact of many drugs on the health of mothers. So these gaps have significant costs. So this is one of my favorite slides. I always impose it on people, but the idea is that while excluding pregnant people from biomedical research eliminates, if you will, reproductive risk in research contexts, it doesn't eliminate risk. Instead, it just shifts it to the clinical context where it grows. And so for much of the remaining 10 minutes that I have, I'm going to talk about 3 of the kinds of harms that result from this shifting of risk. There are more, but these are the 3 that are particularly compelling and that I've looked at in my life and used to make the case for inclusion. So the first is ineffective treatment. So what we know is that pregnant bodies are different. They're not just shaped differently, they are physiologically different. So there are massive changes in the cardiovascular, gastrointestinal, renal, and enzymatic system. And what that means is that pregnancy can dramatically affect how the body interacts with drugs. And what this means is that the normal adult dose of a drug may be inappropriate for a pregnant person. It may be too low. And so that a pregnant person who is, brave enough to take a medication without robust data about its safety may be taking that medication exposed to the harms of potential harms or just the worry of taking that medication, but also be exposed to the disease because the drug is at too low of a dose to treat the disease, or the dose might be too high and lead to excess toxicity. So one of a dramatic example of this we learned about in our work in HIV. It had to do with a drug called cobicistat. And I know we have a variety of medical and non-medical folks here, but so don't get overwhelmed if graphs overwhelm you. It's a pretty straightforward story. So cobicistat is an HIV booster drug, which means it's a drug that you combine with antiretrovirals to boost their activity in the body and make them more effective. It was approved in 2012. It was used in pregnancy. And then 6 years later, in 2018, they discovered that when they measured the level of that drug in pregnant bodies, there was a dramatically reduced concentration of the drug and the drug that it was meant to boost, which raised strong concerns that the HIV wasn't going to be treated effectively, that there would be viral resistance, and even vertical transmission, meaning transmission from a HIV infected mother to her fetus. So women were taking this drug, pregnant people were taking this drug for 6 years without knowing this. The FDA now recommends against its use in pregnancy. Okay, so the second harm is inappropriate risk. So one of the stark facts that is, I think, pressing this area of research forward is that the teratogenic risk of medications is undetermined for 90% of drugs, and for recently approved drugs, 95%. Prescribed medications may be unsafe for the fetus. This is what everybody worries about. And moreover, given gaps on maternal outcomes, medications deemed safe for the fetus may carry inappropriate risk for the pregnant person. We've been seeing this in HIV with adverse maternal outcomes now being gathered around drugs that are used for vertical transmission, to prevent vertical transmission. So the classic example of this was thalidomide. You can't really talk about fetal risk without talking about thalidomide. Thalidomide was a drug developed for the treatment of morning sickness in the 1950s. It was approved in more than 20 countries, including Canada, Europe, and Australia. And by 1962, this drug was linked to severe birth defects called phocomelia. These are limb reduction abnormalities, so problems with the way that legs and arms were formed, among others. It affected more than 10,000 pregnancies worldwide, but it was quite remarkably blocked. The approval was blocked in the US by this person here named Frances Kelsey. She was a pharmacologist and physician, and she told the drug companies that she was not satisfied with the data, and she was worried that there might be a risk, and she wasn't going to prove it until she saw more data. So this was an important thing that she did. She received the Medal of Honor for blocking this drug. But, not only did we see a hero, we saw a public response to the idea of risk in pregnancy. So what happened was the public became aware that the pregnant body was, and the placenta was permeable, and that drugs could cause harm to fetuses. But the problem was that exclusion of pregnant people from research, which was part of what the response was a paradoxical response. The disaster was due not to including pregnant people in research, but to inadequate research in pregnancy. The effects of thalidomide, as Kelsey herself said, should have been recognized in a well-controlled clinical study involving comparatively few patients in pregnancy. This quote, I just should note, was from a colleague of mine, Miranda Wagner, who went to the Library of Medicine and had studied the Kelsey papers, and we learned that sort of if you will, Kelsey is on our side when we're talking about conducting research in pregnancy. She also noted the importance of research. She said conduct of clinical trials in pregnant women presents special problems, but is necessary to assure the safe and effective use of drugs. The third harm is what we call reticence. So because of these fetal safety concerns, policymakers and doctors are reticent to recommend, and women are reticent to use medications. Failure to treat may harm both pregnant person and fetus, and harms of undertreatment may outweigh the risks of medication use. For the purposes of time, I'm going to skip over my example here, but I want to make strong note of the fact that when the COVID vaccine was approved, there were no studies on pregnant people, although they were at higher risk of severely adverse outcomes than non-pregnant people. And what we saw was strong reticence to use vaccines in pregnancy rates of circling around 15% in some populations months after the vaccine was approved. So just to note, we've been gathering data post-approval. Vaccine rates are better now in pregnancy, but there is enduring misinformation and low vaccine rates. Much lower than you might expect. So I'll talk about Rupella sometime if you want to hear about it. But in summary, without adequate evidence, pregnant persons may be given drugs at the wrong dose. They may be given drugs with unacceptable risk, and they may be denied access to beneficial drugs. The fourth harm is that some clinical trials offer the prospect of direct benefit, and pregnancy can be a barrier to inclusion. This is particularly harmful where treatment options are limited or the condition is life-threatening. So a classic example was the Ebola epidemic. 95% of pregnant people and 100% of fetuses die when they get Ebola, and yet pregnant people were excluded from the trials, leading commentators to note that pregnant people were protected to death. I'm not going to talk much about this barriers slide because I think we're going to talk about barriers to inclusion later, but I like to focus on the fact that there is a narrow focus on eliminating fetal risk rather than thinking about balancing risks and benefits to the woman and the fetus, and also of doing the research and not doing the research. I want to call attention to three conceptual shifts that are now sort of entering the public consciousness that our group helped to articulate, but that, again, I think we should talk about a little bit in more detail when our panelists discuss. One is a shift from understanding or conceptualizing pregnant people as a vulnerable population. They were once listed alongside children, prisoners, and individuals with mental, intellectual disabilities as a vulnerable population. This is not only inaccurate, that pregnant people can't make decisions for themselves, but it also had a chilling effect on research. So now they're conceived as a complex population. The second shift is from protecting pregnant people from research to protecting them through research. And the third is from understanding the roles of IRBs and other research ethics organizations as accepting the presumption of excluding pregnant people. So if you were going to exclude pregnant people from research, you didn't have to justify it. To fair inclusion, asking, is this population representative of the population who will be using the drug? Thinking about access to data as an ethical imperative. I'm going to wrap up with just to mention sort of three ethical foundations that we think more helpfully frame what are the obligations of those who conduct and oversee research. One is protection, which is the idea that an animating mission of research is to protect the public from the harms of unsafe or inappropriate drugs, and pregnant people deserve the same protection that other populations. Two is access. The idea is without data, sometimes pregnant people lack access to drugs that they need, either because their doctors are unwilling to prescribe them or they're unwilling to take them, and they deserve access to drugs that they need to keep them healthy and safe. And third is respect. So when you do research with pregnant populations, it's important to get outcomes not just related to the fetus, but to the pregnant people themselves. So that's a summary. This is one of my favorite pictures of Frances Kelsey getting the Medal of Honor from President Kennedy. And her quote is that it would indeed be unfortunate if fear of adverse effects to the offspring deprive the mother of drugs that might be essential to her well-being and indeed possibly also the successful outcome of pregnancy itself. So thanks so much for listening, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much. Dr. Sealy-Jefferson, do you want to go next to introduce yourself, your research, and the way in which you've been thinking about the inclusion of pregnant participants in your research?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Howard, for inviting me to join this conversation, and to Dr. Drapkin, Lyerly, so much for your overview. As a social epidemiologist, I am focused on the way our society is organized and how that organization is related to population health outcomes. One of the things that I just want to preface my comments with is that, I am a member of the community that my research is in service of. So I kind of bristle when I hear people say the institution, the IRBs are to protect, the community and the populations from researchers, because I have a unique position. So to me, the institution cannot protect my community from me doing research that is in service of our liberation. But that could be a longer conversation than I think we have time for. My research is community-based. I do mixed methodologies. We are focused on getting evidence for action that is going to be novel and be useful and policy relevant. And I really appreciated the conversation about drugs and how pregnant people being excluded from research because of the potential adverse effects of drugs is problematic. But I also wanted to raise up into our consciousness the problem of excluding pregnant people from research when we're talking about social exposures, like structural and institutional racism. So we know that maternal mortality has been increasing, and we know that there are disgusting inequities in maternal mortality, and these have persisted for a very long time. Same with the outcomes of infant mortality and infant morbidities and maternal morbidities as well. For over 100 years, we see these inequities by race, and we do not see improvements or decreases in these inequities at the population level when we have spent millions of dollars on interventions focused on social support, focused on biology, focused on clinical care. None of these things have been able to decrease these racial inequities. So the only thing that's left is the social context in which people live. And if pregnant people are being not being able to be included in research, especially research that's focused on people's experiences with structural and institutional racism during pregnancy and also before pregnancy and also after pregnancy, what this means is we don't have evidence. And there's a saying, no data, no problem. And so without this data, we cannot talk about, without the documentation of these issues, we can't talk about what are some potential solutions. What should we be doing differently than what has been done in the past? Because clearly what's been done in the past hasn't worked because we haven't addressed the root causes of these issues. So if we don't address the root causes of these issues, then for me, this means people in my community are at increased risk of early mortality from pregnancy-related causes, and then also for a whole host of other things. And I find that unacceptable. Actually, that is unethical. To put these, constraints around who can and cannot participate in research, when we absolutely need the research to be able to document some of these issues and to do it within communities, within populations, and especially to focus on the communities that are most impacted by the things that we don't have the evidence about. So my framing is not about clinical and not about drugs and not about behavioral issues, but about the way our society is organized and how we don't have evidence about how racism is shortening the lives of Black women and families and communities. And at what point do we say, well, maybe IRBs aren't the arbiter of safety and protection, and maybe we need to rethink this, because I am seeing, as a social epidemiologist, I see this data. A lot of what I focus my research on is not that different from what W.E.B. Du Bois was talking about in the 1800s. So like, these are not new conversations, but racism was declared a public health crisis in 2020. But racism did not become a public health crisis in 2020. So that's also part of it is like, are we going to tell the truth about what is and is not the cause, who and what is responsible for these racial and ethnic inequities in health at the population level, is sort of what I think a whole lot about. And this question about pregnant people and not including pregnant people in the research, it has generational consequences. Multiple generations are negatively impacted by this. So I will stop there, and thank you so much for I look forward to our conversation. Thank you for the opportunity to share.
Thank you for those introductory remarks. I really look forward to the conversation where we talk about comparisons between social research and biomedicine. And Dr. Constantine, do you want to introduce your own research, your perspective, and the sort of challenges and the way in which you've been thinking about the inclusion of pregnant participants?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Howard, for inviting me to participate. And I agree, and really great presentations by Dr. Drapkin, Lyerly, and Dr. Sealy-Jefferson. I agree with everything you've said. I'm a clinician, pretty much in training, maternal fetal medicine, which is we deal with high-risk pregnancy complications. At the same time, I conduct clinical research, translational research, trying to look at interventions per se to prevent pregnancy complications, or look at associations with long-term outcomes for the mother and fetus. There is two. I agree with the concerns that were brought up regarding the lack of inclusion of pregnant people in research, both biomedical and social research, in order to address root causes, as well as to address some interventions that potentially can reduce maternal and infant mortality and morbidity. And this is something that's not particularly new right now. We've been dealing with the lack of inclusions for years, and unfortunately, although there's more talk about it right now, but I'm not sure we're actually moving in the right direction in terms of actually moving the needle forward. And we can talk later on about some of the examples, in particular in my own research regarding repurposing medications to prevent pregnancy complications, and the barriers we've had to endure for the past 12 to 15 years with regulatory agencies, at a time where regulatory agencies on other parts and other countries actually are moving much faster than where we are moving here right now. There's also the clinical problem. Dr. Drapkin Lyerly mentioned Ebola, which was a great example, because Ebola was pretty much devastating for pregnant people and their children, with 95% to 100% mortality. One of the medications that was actually studied in Ebola was the remdesivir. And then when COVID happened, and earlier on, we found that remdesivir was actually effective against COVID. Pregnant women were not included in these studies to test remdesivir, not just whether it's effective in pregnant people, but also what dose they should be given at. And it was left to the clinicians, pretty much the risk, as Dr. Drapkin Lyerly put beautifully in her slide, the risk was shifted from the research community to the clinical community, and it was magnified because you have a pregnant person infected with COVID, and it's up to the clinician right now to treat her with whatever they think works or doesn't work. And I think that highlighted the the kind of the whole problem and the fact that we haven't learned much from our prior failures to include pregnant people in current epidemic. And I'm really worried about where we're going with this. There's a lot of, the other major point I just want to bring up, which I think Dr. Drapkin Lyerly alluded to briefly, is that the research or the risk and benefit ratio should be put in the context in which it was studied. If we're studying a medication or a device to treat a certain condition, it shouldn't be studied in silo. It should be studied in the context of that particular disease or condition and the risks of untreated or poorly treated medical condition. So I'm just going to stop right now since we're actually almost 12:30, but we can get back to some of these questions later on. But this is really exciting. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. So let's start with a very broad question, and then we'll sort of narrow in on some of the specifics that you've already sort of alluded to. So the first is, and feel free to use your own examples from your own work or cases that you've seen in the wild. When is it appropriate to study pregnant people? When is it inappropriate? And when is it necessary? And maybe we could start with Dr. Constantine, and then we could go to Dr. Sealy-Jefferson, and then finally Dr. Drapkin Lyerly.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think just to go back, there are certain conditions that I think affect, or we know that affect pregnant people specifically, for which the research is necessary in this population. Example, hyperemesis gravidarum, which is excessive nausea and vomiting early in pregnancy. Preterm labor, which is the lead cause of infant morbidity and mortality in the US and worldwide, and a major driver of actually the racial disparities in infant mortality. And preeclampsia, for example. This is another major example in which only occurs in pregnant people, but it has long-term implications on the mother and the fetus and later on the child. So for these conditions, I think it's necessary to study it in pregnancy because there's no other you can deduce the data from outside of pregnancy. And other than this, I think some of the other medical conditions that affect the general population also can affect pregnant people. This is an appropriate condition in which interventions can or should be studied in pregnant people. And then you can talk later on, and I think Dr. Drapkin Lyerly alluded to earlier about benefit for the mother only versus benefit for the child only versus benefit for both, etc. And these becomes different examples in which the research should be discussed, or the appropriateness of the research is a little bit different. There are certain conditions that affect the fetus specifically, things like irregular heartbeat in the fetus. When the mom has normal heart rate, but the fetus has irregular or sometimes very fast heart rate, which can lead to fetal demise. These are conditions in which treatment needs to be done for the sole benefit of the fetus, but there is risk on the mother. And other condition in which we're treating the mother, like seizure disorders, but there's no benefit particularly for the fetus, except under the context that a poorly treated maternal condition is the risk for adverse pregnancy outcomes that affect the fetus.
Thank you.
I mean, Dr. Constantine is the expert, so I will not just say I agree, but like, I want to say something about like language and like framing of our work. So to me, and this is to me, we should not be doing research on communities. Like, yes, we need this information, and the intention behind the work should always be liberation for the communities that we're doing our research for. Like, we should be doing our research in service of doing research on, I mean, and this is just about like the history of atrocities committed against communities like mine and other people's communities. I think it is important to say that for the stuff that I do, for the research that social epidemiologists do, pregnant people should always be included in the research, because so what we do is we focus on exposures and not the outcome, which is somewhat of a different framing from the way regular epidemiologists who focus on outcomes. We as social epidemiologists focus on exposures. And so in that sense, pregnant people should always be included in research around social exposures that they may have experienced or not. But I think it is there's a lot of complications that we need to be mindful about because my work is focused on the community that I'm a member of. If we think about people who are doing research in communities and in service of communities that they don't belong to, I think we have to ask some additional questions, like, is your intention to support the liberation of the community that you're doing your work for? And if it's not, it's unethical for you to even be doing research using the data from that community. So that's something that I don't hear a lot of people talking about, but I think this is true in this context of research on pregnant people, but it goes beyond that. It's not just about that. And we shouldn't be doing research on anybody. We should be partnering with, especially for these inequities by race and other identity factors. We should be partnering with the communities that are most impacted by these things. And I'm talking about partnering and like letting them co-lead the work so that we get closer to solutions. So if your goal is publications and promotion and tenure and like all of those things, that's unethical. We don't need research just for the sake of documenting issues. We need research that leads to solutions. And if your intention is not solutions to these problems, it's unethical for you to be even doing research.
Thank you. And Dr. Drapkin Lyerly.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I just want to say thank you to the co-panelists who so eloquently articulated these complementary areas of thinking about inclusion. So in some ways, I have to think about what to add, but one of the things that I have learned along the way is that in our research, sort of thinking about how to, if you will, solve the ethical problems that we see, one of the most powerful sources of information are research participants, potential research participants, and communities themselves. And I think we've learned a lot from those communities that have informed the guidance going forward. But I think in some ways it falls into two kinds of categories. So one of them is, sort of what kind of research seems like the right kind of research to do? What kinds of risks and benefits make sense to you? What are your worries? What are your priorities? Those kinds of things. But the questions that have been most interesting to me as a bioethicist is when I ask research participants about our ethical framing of research, right? What concerns you ethically, right? What do you think about the research regulations? What do you think about requirements for consent of the father? When we went to Southern Africa and asked research participants about some of the regulations that are very common, contraception requirements, participation of partners and families, parameters for doing research on fetal tissue, our intuitions weren't confirmed, right? So we learned about ambiguity, and we learned about new kinds of ethical concerns and framing. And I think that's what we're hearing with adolescents as well. But I think it's a powerful tool to not think that you have the frame right in the first place. So, because that frame has determined the kinds of research that we've done. If you look at the HIV epidemic, the big worry for everyone was vertical transmission from a woman to a baby. And so we had 25 years of research on fine-tuning prevention of vertical transmission, and yet pregnant people were excluded from all of the prevention research. The development of PrEP, the pills that you take not to get HIV in the first place, they weren't included in those trials. They have been excluded from trials of malaria and tuberculosis, things that cause maternal death and infant death. So, I think we have to be very aware of the things that we notice, oftentimes fetal risk, and the ways that that frames the kind of research priorities that are made. We notice the fetus, we don't notice the woman, we don't notice the community. How to have that have an impact on policy and funding and the kind of research is done, that's a big challenge, but I think we have to start by listening. And so I really appreciate Dr. Sealy-Jefferson's sort of reminder about that. It's been an honor to be able to listen for me.
So this is part of what you're talking about is in some ways the state of the regulations, the potential limitations about what the regulations can actually do to promote justice when it comes to the priority setting for research and the inclusion of participants who are pregnant. And so this goes to the second question that actually aligns with one of the participant audience questions. So I'm just going to ask them together. So this is from Jan Weissenberger. The idea of thinking about a population is complex, which is the way in which the shift has been made officially in the regulations. Rather than vulnerable seems to change the dynamic between the research and participant. I would like to hear the panelists say more about this. And maybe also just, this is an opportunity to hear from you how you think about this shift in the regulations, whether you think the shift has gone far enough, and whether there's more that can be done on the sort of regulatory infrastructure to ensure that research is conducted with the values and interests of pregnant participants rather than just on pregnant participants. So why don't we, whoever wants to go first can go first. If no one jumps in, I'll start pointing at people.
I'm happy to talk about a little bit about vulnerability. So, I think people, since the language was changed in 2018 in the federal regulations, and actually it's changed in sort of the preamble, it's something called the common rule. And so they've just removed pregnant people from that list of vulnerable populations, but that didn't change subpart B that governs research with pregnant people. But the question is whether it has had an impact, right? And, I think that's very hard to measure, whether it's had an impact. I think about it partly, is the change something, is it an impactful change, or is it a sign of the times? Because as Dr. Constantine mentioned, people are talking about these things more. So, when I first started talking about this, it was surprising. There was a lot of resistance to the arguments, and now really people understand the need to do research in pregnancy, and they also understand the ridiculousness of calling a pregnant person vulnerable. I used to give talks while I was 7-8 months pregnant and critiqued this notion of vulnerability and say, so you're listening to me, and yet I can't provide consent for myself because somehow I lose my autonomy when I'm pregnant. So, I do think it's a matter of respect. And I also think that it did in the past have a chilling effect on research because the sort of mental switch went to protection first rather than access. But I think the change is going to be slow. There's a lot of patterns that this notion of vulnerability has encoded in the hearts and minds and the structures of research. I mean, for instance, just sort of like IRB checklists. Are you including pregnant people? No. Next question. Are you including children? If you check the box yes for pregnant people, then you have to fill out 10 more pages of why that's okay. So that is sort of something that's been encoded by the notion of vulnerability. And so we have to bring these other ideas to the fore. I think it's going to take time. I don't know if it's had an effect, but I'm glad to see that it's happened.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's difference between the vulnerability piece indicated that these people cannot make an informed consent, an informed decision, which is ridiculous. And in fact, you know, Dr. Drapkin early on mentioned the COVID vaccine. In pregnant people were not included in any COVID vaccine trial at all. And in fact, when later on one of the companies wanted to do a trial, it was too late because they were just taking it. So people just start taking the vaccine based on the potential risk and benefit as they assess it at that moment, based on the data that was available from non-pregnant people. So this is, and especially, I think initially started with healthcare workers who were pregnant and then some other pregnant people. So that basically proves that, and which we didn't need any proof, that a pregnant person can actually make an informed decision based on the available data. And they should not have been from the beginning included as a vulnerable population. But so that's the difference between the two. And I think hopefully more people are realizing the fact that this is not, you know, the complexity that stems from the part that you're dealing with pretty much the fetus and the pregnant mom, that there is significant changes in the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, which is the way the body handles the medication and the way the medication affects the body of pregnant person than non-pregnant person. And potentially there's significant other comorbidities that could be happening, make the situation a little bit more medically complicated per se. But whether this has affected or changed the behavior, I am a little bit skeptic right now. I think, and partly from my experience, partly from what we've seen, there's more and more people aware of it and actually wanted to do things. But the example of the IRB is pretty good example. If then checking that box whether you're pregnant or not still leads to a significant number of additional work. Any company wants to do a study, then most of you look at the exclusion criteria should be pregnant, or if reproductive age should be on X contraceptive method, and then we test and all these things, which is sometimes unfounded or ridiculous. And I'll give an example. When and I'm funded by NIH, so I'm not going to talk bad about NIH, but then the NIH's trials that were conducted for COVID treatment, the ACT trials and all these things, excluded pregnant people. The recovery study in the United Kingdom allowed the inclusion of pregnant people. And in particular, when they studied the effect of steroids on the management of moderate to severe disease in general, there was a subgroup of pregnant people in the analysis. So we used the data from the recovery studies in the United Kingdom to actually inform the care of pregnant people in the United States, whereas here, pregnant people were excluded from these trials at all. So this is just an example where we are. Another example based on my personal research with repurposing statins, which is a cholesterol-lowering medication, to prevent preeclampsia, a very dangerous and common condition in pregnancy that affects Black pregnant people much higher frequency. The disease is much severe in Black pregnant people. We were able to do studies, pilot studies, on the medication, and showed significant benefit after a lot of other data in preclinical studies. We even have long-term data on the offspring that were exposed to this drug when they were 5 years of age, but yet we were asked again by regulatory agencies to go back and do rat studies, look for the effect of toxic doses on the rat offspring. So that's where I think the disconnect, where there are certain boxes that regulatory agencies have to check before you move forward, whereas the clinical needs and the research sometimes moves a little bit faster, but you're constrained by what you have to do, which may or may not make sense, because we know right now that 90% of data from rats do not apply to humans, and especially when you're testing a drug at a much higher concentration that will ever be used in a pregnant person. So I'll stop for now.
Dr. Sealy-Jefferson, do you have any other thoughts about the regulations?
I think I agree with what has already been said about this. I think that this justice orientation is something that researchers and the regulatory agencies should endeavor to let be the intention behind the work, behind the regulations, behind the research. And I think that'll move us forward. I agree with Dr. Constantine. We haven't made as much progress as we need to make on this issue, but I think a justice framing and orientation might help lead the way.
So just jumping into, and Dr. Sealy-Jefferson, you could be the first to answer this question. Thinking about barriers to inclusion besides the way that pregnant participants are treated in the regulation. So what other barriers have you found as you've conducted research, and how can we move into really thinking more proactively about how to ensure that the actual research questions that are of value to pregnant participants are being asked and recruited appropriately?
Thank you. This is such a complicated question. One of the things that I have encountered in my work, which is again in the community that I'm a member of, is skepticism about motives because of memories about past harms from researchers in our community, and also about the history of harms that have been visited upon communities of color specifically by researchers. So some of it is like, yes, you're saying you care, and yes, you're saying you're doing this research for our liberation. I noticed one of these questions in this chat was about liberation. This is a lot of people have written about this, the shift that needs to happen in terms of orientation of researchers, especially around racial and ethnic inequities at the population level. And I'm a public health person, so it's a different orientation than like the clinical researchers. But a challenge is that, do you know that the last widow of a man who was forced into Tuskegee experiments died in 2009? That wasn't that long ago. 2009 was not that long ago. So we talk about the Tuskegee experiment as something that happened so long ago. And no, somebody was on the planet who was married to a man who was forced into that experiment. She just died in 2009. It means there's a lot of people on the planet still who were negatively impacted by this, by having a relative forced into this experiment. And so then there's a difference between mistrust and distrust. And my community has very good reason not to want to participate in research. It's not about some expectation that something bad might happen. We have real evidence about bad things happening all the time from researchers. And so I think that that's a big challenge. And I don't get to overcome those challenges because I'm a member of the community that my work is in service of, but having people who are from the communities leading the work and doing the thinking necessary to advance solutions to these problems, because we don't get to do research just for the sake of intellectual curiosity, because people who are from our families and people who look like us in our communities are dying prematurely from these things that our research should be helping. So we need more diversity in who is doing the research. We need no solutions, nothing for communities without them. So if your solution to a problem that is impacting a community that you're not a member of involves just doing research on those communities, that is part of the problem.
Dr. Drapkin, Lyerly, do you want to just share your own thoughts, especially because I cut short your slide, the beautiful slide.
Oh, about barriers to inclusion? Is that the one?
Yeah, about barriers.
Yeah, I mean, I again sort of want to thank Dr. Sealy-Jefferson for her for her eloquence and naming this issue, which I agree continues to be important. We think about the Henrietta Lacks case, which is a very modern example of risk and harm that doesn't have to do with the drug that you're taking, right? It has to do with the people who are conducting the research. So, and there is work that needs to be done to, build trust that is lost, and that is a hard thing to do. We learned about many kinds of barriers to conducting the research. One of the things that I think, if I don't name it when I participate in a panel like this, somebody always emails me about it, which is worries about the legal implications of doing research. So, again, this is sort of hearts and minds of researchers, institutions, pharmaceutical companies that tend to be empowered when they're thinking about research priorities. But there is a problem of individuals in those spaces worrying about the legal implications of doing research, which are both legal implications of if harm happens within a study, will the researcher, the institution, the pharmaceutical company be sued? And if you develop a drug and you label it for pregnancy and harm ensues after that, then there is risk to the company that they don't want to introduce for themselves. They'd rather say, don't take it when you're pregnant, and if you take it, it's on you and your doctor. So, there is a National Academies group that's trying to develop solutions to some of these problems and to understand them better. And I think they're important, but I also think it's important to note that in research, as in reproductive medicine, more generally, the worries about liability are often used as an excuse for not doing the right thing. And, we have to be skeptical of those claims, but also think about them because they tend to motivate folks. I guess I won't say I have a solution to it, but I think we should stay tuned for the National Academy's report on that.
So this is the final question. I will have to say that there's more Q&A, like questions in the Q&A than ever in a panel before. So one thing is we'll post the questions on the CHV website afterwards, because people have been really thoughtful about the sorts of questions and concerns that they've been bringing up. So the final one, it's kind of an elephant in the room. We've sort of skirted around it, but some people have talked about it. Some people in the questions have sort of asked it. So I'm going to start with the way in which Anna Nelson asked the question, which is, how do you think about how we can best protect and move towards inclusion of pregnant participants and the necessary focus on maternal rather than just fetal health, given the current political climate? And another potential way of thinking about this is how our current reproductive policies and the reproductive health restrictions that have been imposed, which actually make things more risky for pregnant people, how does that change the way in which we should think about the ethics of research when it comes to researching pregnant participants? And this is the final question, so feel free to have the last say and add whatever else you want to add to it. We could start with Dr. Constantine, and then we could have Dr. Drapkin Lyerly, and finally Dr. Sealy-Jefferson.
That's a great question. I think this was continuous change in the political and then stance in Ohio and elsewhere in the country. I think that makes it really more important, adds the burden and kind of the risk that many researchers and practitioners have in whether conducting research or actually practicing medicine. I think at the end of the day, as researchers, we should be doing the right thing. And there are, doing the right thing in terms of one, asking the right questions to the right people and actually doing the work to answer some of these questions. And kind of moving beyond what is the political climate right now, looking at the longer view, what we need to do to improve the health of the mother, not short term, but also long term. I mean, the rate of comorbidities that are occurring in pregnant people is increasing, from diabetes, hypertension, advanced maternal age, many other conditions. The structural racism that we always talked about is still kind of stuck where we are, has really no significant movement in that. So a lot of these will add significant burden to maternal health. And as researchers and clinicians and people who are working to improve maternal health, that should be our goal, to keep doing. Now, there's a lot of practical things how some of the research can be done, which we can get into in terms of when do you include the pregnant person in a new medication trial, for example. There are different phases where these drugs are tested. At what point do you include the pregnant person? Can you get data from non-pregnant people and do some simulation to figure out what is the best dose that can be used in a pregnant person? There's a lot of other scenarios in which we can actually more practically get some answers and then move the needle forward. But I think in the great scheme of things, we're just going to have to keep moving.
So I will just add, as Dr. Howard mentioned, research is riskier now that abortion is not protected in the United States. An important fact is that modern research regulations were promulgated just about the time that Roe v. Wade was passed. And so we have never in the modern history of research ethics not had research protections, abortion protections in place, as we have done our very modest, in some cases, abysmal work in collecting necessary data on pregnant people. And now it's even harder and more complicated. And one example of that is the fact that the World Health Organization recommends, not as a hard recommendation, but as a soft one and an important one, that if abortion is not available, then you should think about not doing research in that population if the research could have an adverse effect on the fetus. I think it's a problematic recommendation, but the idea is that if an intervention could harm a fetus and the pregnant person doesn't have access to intervention, it raises the ethical complexity. It doesn't have access to abortion, it raises the ethical complexity of the research. The problem is, again, when you transfer that into the clinical setting and you think about now what our clinical reality is, we have a lack of data to inform the use of medications and coerced gestation together. So we don't have the data we need to inform the healthiest pregnancy outcomes for women and their babies, and women have no choice in whether to be pregnant or not. So it's a complicated question. It's a complicated time for doing research in pregnancy, but it's never been more urgent.
I just want to just say you don't get to be brave if you don't practice brave. I don't know the answer to this question. This is what a world. Researchers have to be brave. We have to resist. We have to do the work we know we should do. We should do the right thing. A lot of this is conceptual, but actually it's not. We have to resist. Like we know what the data is clear about the inequities, about the people most impacted by things, about the people who are left out of the conversation, about the solutions that have significant public health investment, financial investment, significant, but haven't worked. We're clear about all of those things. So I think what it's going to take some radical truth telling, radical coalition building among researchers and in partnership with community. And we just have to keep doing the work that we know needs to be done and resisting these oppressive regimes of policy and it literally is gonna, because sometimes people say, oh, this is such a horrible problem. And this is a horrible problem. A lot of these political contexts that we're working in, horrible. And then sometimes people say, well, I wish somebody would do something about that. And then the only answer to that is, aren't you somebody? All of us are somebody. So we should all be doing our part to resist these systems and structures that are costing people their lives and are having negative implications across generations. So I would offer that in response to this question.
So unfortunately, we are already 7 minutes over, but I really do appreciate the conversation that you've started. I think that this is an open question and a conversation that us within the Ohio State University community have to work on and think about and talk amongst each other about. And I really appreciate Dr. Sealy-Jefferson, Dr. Constantine for joining us and sort of spearheading this conversation. And I appreciate Dr. Drapkin Lyerly coming in and spreading your wealth of knowledge and your wisdom. It's been really a pleasure to have this conversation with you all today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.